That's heavy. Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. I'm going to try and get a little work done on the South Bend lathe today by getting this headstock disassembled into its different pieces so I can examine everything and get it all cleaned up. Well, there's just a couple of slotted head screws here that hold the guard that covers the bull gear. There's this little flip-up door that's attached to the guard that you use to access the knob to engage or disengage the bull gear for using the lathe in back gear. That's just held on with a bolt and a nut. There's also a guard that covers the back gear, and this should have two screws in it. One of them is missing and broken, actually, and that's because of the tab that's on the cover is broken. I'll have to figure out what I need to do to fix that. It's made out of steel, so maybe we'll practice some brazing on it. The cover for the cone pulley is hinged on the back of the headstock with a couple of pointed set screws and jam nuts. Now this cover is non-magnetic, so it's aluminum. The cover that's on my 1942 South Bend is made out of steel. I imagine that they did that because aluminum was in high demand for the war effort. This one being made in 1960, there wasn't as high a demand by the Department of Defense. I don't know if these pieces prior to the war were made out of aluminum or if it just became more available, more cost effective to start making them out of aluminum by the time that this one was made. Now there is this hole that looks like it was drilled in from the bottom of the door, and I think it might have been to thread in something. I don't believe that was original, so I'll probably go ahead and TIG weld this up and sand it smooth. The back gear shaft is held captive in the headstock through a couple of bushings that are held in place with a couple of square-headed set screws. Now these set screws are also used to set the tension on the back gear shaft to help keep it engaged when you want it engaged. If this is too loose, then the lathe has a tendency to pop out of back gear when you're using it. So these have to be adjusted just right to keep it in back gear when you want it in back gear. Now the point on this screw should be at a sharp point, and this one right here is pretty mangled. I might end up having to make a replacement for this one. You can see how this other set screw is at a nice fine point. So yeah, we'll definitely have to make a new one of these. I'm going to use a punch here to extract the shaft for the back gear. It's meant to be a fairly tight fit. This is a little tighter than I remember the 42 being, but it came out fairly easily with just a few taps of a hammer. While all of the teeth on the gears look like they're in really great shape, I have no worries there. The back gear shaft and handle, the eccentric, looks like it's in good shape. I don't think I'm going to disassemble this any further than this. I'm pretty sure I can clean it up in the parts washer before repainting the handle. Then there's this split bushing that is what actually applies the proper tension on that shaft to keep it from popping out too easily. Well, now's as good a time as any to start draining some of the oil out of the headstock. I'll put a little piece of pig mat underneath it to collect the drips, but I can just use an open end wrench here to twist off these oil cups that are used to fill the reservoirs underneath the spindle bearings. There are also two plugs, one above and one below where the oil cups attach. I don't really know what these are for, but they're just set screws that I use an Allen key wrench to remove. If you know what the purpose is of these plugs, leave a comment. I'd like to learn as much as I can. I get the one on the bottom here is probably for draining the oil just like I'm doing now, but the one on the top I'm not really all that sure of. I guess it could be as a vent to help the oil drain a little bit faster, maybe, but I would think the oil cup itself might serve the same purpose. Well, to start the process of disassembling the spindle, the first thing I need to do is loosen this screw that allows me to back off the take-up nut. The main spindle output gear just slides off. The 1942, it's actually a press fit. On this gear, all the teeth are in great shape. I see nothing wrong with it. There's a woodruff key that holds that gear in place, and then I can remove the thrust bearing, or well, at least I thought. The reverser is actually in the way of me taking off the thrust bearing, so we're going to have to take care of that first. Well, the reverser is held on with a clamp, and that clamp is attached to the headstock with a couple of screws, and I can't seem to get to them with a screwdriver, so I don't know if I need to take these two gears off or not, the stud gear and the reverser's output gear. I think I'll go ahead and try to take those off and see if that gives me any more room. Well, the stud gear came off easy enough, although this other gear here is not going to come off very easy. And I don't know that I really should be taking this off just to get the reverser out. It doesn't make sense that I would have to do that. Let me think about this. I have the headstock propped up on a 2x4, and that gives me a little better access to the screws that hold that clamp on. So I don't think I'm going to need to take this gear off at all. With that clamp off, the reverser comes right out, and looking over it, it looks to be in really good shape besides being dirty. All the gear teeth look fantastic, a lot better than the gear teeth on my 1942 reverser. Of course, the Gets oil cup, the little lid that goes on the oil tube, it's missing, but that seems to be typical. And now I have access to take off the thrust bearing here. And this looks like it's in pretty decent shape. It's dirty and caked with some dried oil, but I think it'll clean up pretty good. At least I hope so, because these are unobtainium. Well, now I can turn my attention to the bearing caps. We'll start with the rear here. These are a little bit more complicated than the 1942 lathe. That lathe just used plain cast bearing, so the bearing itself was cast into the cap and into the headstock and machined. There's no roller bearings, there's no bronze bushing, no nothing in that lathe. This one, however, uses these split bronze bushings. Well, I suppose technically they're split bronze bearings. Now, underneath those plugs that I removed first, there's a couple of slotted head screws that have to come out next. Now, these attach into a bronze expander that's part of the bronze split bearing setup. It's important that these come out first before you try to remove the bearing caps. Otherwise, you could damage the bearing itself. And again, those are impossible to find. Well, with the screws for the expander out, I can now remove the main screws for the bearing cap. Well, with those main screws out, I just use the same Allen key to apply a little leverage, and that helps sort of unstick the bearing cap. There's a couple of dowels that hold this in position, and they can be a little tight to remove. I'll keep these shims together for now, although I think I'm going to go ahead and order new ones off of eBay. There's a guy who makes layered shims that I believe are laser cut to fit these lathes, and I'll just get new ones and then dial it in appropriately. Here's that expander I mentioned. It is dovetailed into the split bearing, which is why it's important to remove those screws before you try to take the bearing cap off. I just need to repeat the same process for the front bearing cap. Well, with those bearing caps off, I can remove the spindle now out of the headstock. I do expect this to give me a little bit of resistance. I imagine it's been sitting in this position for quite a number of years. So a little gentle persuasion should be all that I need to do.
There we go.
Well, with the spindle now out, I can remove the rear bearing and take a look at it. Other than being a little bit dirty, it's in remarkably great shape. I feel no burrs, no galling, nothing on the spindle or on the inside of the bearing. I'm getting really excited about the condition of this machine. It's in much better shape than the 1942 was in. Besides being dirty, these other thrust bearings look like being in really good shape. They are a little different than the ones that came off the back. They're thicker. At least the set in general is thicker, so I got to make sure I keep those straight. We'll go ahead and zip tie these together like I did the others. But I think after a soak in some solvent, they'll turn out just fine. Spindle will just slide right out of the cone pulley at this point. And again, looking at the surfaces here, it's in remarkably great shape. I see no evidence of galling whatsoever. The bull gear teeth are in fantastic shape. So yeah, I'm really pleased with the condition of this lathe so far. I need to get that front bearing off so I can inspect it and clean it, but in order to do that, I need to get the front bull gear off. My arbor press isn't nearly big enough and I don't have a hydraulic press, so the next best thing is to use a little gentle impact force to get these apart. Well, I want to make sure this thing is properly supported, so I'm going to remove this block here that engages the bull gear to the cone pulley. This is part of the whole back gear mechanism. Okay, that makes me feel better. With that thing out of the way, now I can support the bull gear on all four sides. While using a block of wood and a dead blow on the back end of the spindle, it shouldn't take more than a couple of well-placed hits here, and I should be able to press this spindle through the bull gear. With the bull gear off, I can now remove the front bearing expander and take a look at it, and then also remove the front split bearing. Well, just like the rear spindle bearing, the front bearing sleeve is in remarkably excellent condition, as is the bearing surface on the spindle itself. Well, I think that's going to do it for this video today. This is broken down into as many parts as I want to for now. I need to spend a whole bunch of time getting things cleaned up and ready for reassembly. Well, I can't be happier with the condition of the spindle bearings and the spindle itself. There is some discoloration on the outside of the split sleeves and on the bearing caps. I'm not exactly sure what that's from, but I suspect it's just dried oil and maybe a little discoloration from heat. I'm going to save the reverser for another video because this is a little more complicated to get apart, and there's some oil passages that need to be drilled out, so they can be properly cleared. So I think I'm going to do just a separate video on that. And as I mentioned, I am going to replace these bearing shims. I'll measure these to give me a starting point, but I think it'd be better just to replace them. Well, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's something I might have done wrong or something that you would have done differently. Your likes and your comments really do help with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber. That way you'll know when I publish a new video on this lathe. And if you'd like to be a part of helping contribute to this process, there's some links down in the description on how you can contribute to the channel and help this process along. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.